Okay, so welcome back after a couple weeks off, our Pesach vacation, Passover break, and now we're back at it. What happened at Sinai? We're moving. We're up to, I guess this is the 5th commandment that we're learning, which means we did 1, we did 6, we did 2, and we did 7, and now we're up to 3, the way that we go across like that. So we're up to commandment number 3, which is the commandment which we're about to learn about. So I'll bring up the, I'm going to share my screen. I'll bring up the slides and we'll go from there. Okay, this is number 13. All right, so number 3 is an interesting one to be found in the 10 commandments. Number 3 is, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless or blameless. Really in Hebrew, the word is lo yinakeh. He won't make you clean from it. For who? Someone who takes his name in vain. So basically what we often just refer to as do not take the name of God in vain. As we'll see, it's basically, the more exact understanding of it is specifically in reference to oaths, which we'll get into in a moment, to vows. But it does apply in other, the commentators, the sages do apply also to just, loosely using God's name out of context, not necessarily in the context of a vow, but we'll see that the idea is that we'll discuss it will be understandable why that it applies in different scenarios like that. But what we're going to explore, we'll get into more, is the interesting question of what's so severe. Why, we usually think of the 10 commandments as like, basic things that we would have almost could have come up with ourselves, we say, right? Some are obvious. We asked that question, aren't these obvious? What's so special about them? That's something we've explored. So why does this prohibition of taking God's name in vain fit into the top 10, so to speak, of all the 613 commandments? That's one of the headings. So what's so significant about this? So before we really get into it, let's just try to define what it's talking about. We're going to refer to Sefer HaChinuch, which is the book of mitzvah education. He goes through all 613 mitzvot and basically gives a little description and tries to give a little explanation for what a possible reason behind the mitzvah is. And here in defining the mitzvah, he says as follows. Again, this isn't his own idea. He's really gathering from earlier sources like the Talmud and other places and presenting it to us. So the Sefer HaChinuch explains that this prohibition to not swear in vain is as follows: that we not swear pointlessly using God's name. I mean, you swear by God, right? Or as people like to say, like, I swear to God. That would be the prohibition when it's pointless. As it is stated, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, our verse from the 10 commandments. Now, this notion of pointlessness has 4 types. There's 4 types of vows that would fall under this prohibition. He says the first, for example, that he swears, he or she, about something known to be true, that it is not so. So something obvious and you deny it, like swearing about a pillar of marble, that it is a pillar of gold. So that's a pointless vow. It's not that, it's not simply that it's not true. A person can make a vow and then just not fulfill it and render it untrue, but it wasn't necessarily untrue from the outset. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about where a person makes a vow about something that's not true, but obviously not true from the outset. So again, the example that he gives is, swearing that something is what it isn't, that marble is gold or gold is marble, anything like that. The second, he says, for example, that he swears about what is known to be so, like about a stone that it is a stone and about a tree that it is a tree. So it's true, but it's obvious and there's no meaning because everybody knows. And why are you making a pointless vow and taking God's name in that context to swear that a tree is a tree. That's what we call pointless, and that falls under this prohibition. The third type is that he swears to negate this commandment or the commandments that God, blessed be he, commanded us. Basically, somebody swears that they're not going to follow one of the commandments of the Torah. And this is also considered pointless, since it is not in his hand, it's not in our hands to swear to negate that which God has already obligated him. And it is like the one who swears about something known that is not so. So we are already commanded in these. In a sense, we've already taken an oath, a vow to fulfill the commandments. Our ancestors accepted it, and it carries on to us, these obligations. And if somebody would take a vow that they're not going to fulfill one of the commandments of the Torah, that vow actually won't even take effect. So normally, a vow is actually something very powerful. Normally, if somebody swears that they're going to do something, they've basically created an obligation out of nothing. And it's an obligation that now rides on them to fulfill. It's an ability that we're granted to almost create our own mitzvah, right? To create our own commandment, because we have a commandment to fulfill our vows. It's not this commandment, but there is a commandment to fulfill our vows. So we normally have this tremendous power, and it's to be used very, very cautiously. In fact, historically, people stay far away from vows, and especially in court, and that's why actually when we go to court, we try not to swear to tell the truth, but we affirm instead, because we steer very clear of vows, because they create a new obligation upon us that is very powerful. But a person would try to take such a vow and create an obligation that contradicts an existing obligation. That doesn't work. That just doesn't take effect, and that would fall under this and also be considered pointless. And the fourth type is to swear to do something that a person has no power to do. For example, that he will not sleep for 3 consecutive days, or that he will not eat for 7 consecutive days. I've actually almost not slept for 3 consecutive days once when I was a counselor in a camp, and it was color war, and I slept, I think, about 2 hours out of 50 something hours. I was up all night, 2 nights in a row. It was pretty crazy, but those were in my younger days. But he says, and I didn't quite not sleep at all. So he says not to sleep for 3 consecutive days would be considered, impossible. And such a vow is pointless and falls under this prohibition, or not to eat for 7 consecutive days. So I would think that not eating for 3 days already is harder than not sleeping for 3 days, but what do I know? Okay, but anyways, so we have basically, just to define this prohibition, we have 4 types of vows that fall under it. Number 1, swearing that something, about something that's obviously not the case. So swearing that something, a pillar of marble, is gold. Number 2, swearing that something that is obviously true is true, and like saying that a tree is a tree, that's a pointless vow, and to do so with God's name would violate this commandment. The third is to swear not to fulfill or to go against or to violate one of the existing commandments of the Torah, because we already have a vow upon ourselves to fulfill them, an existing obligation. We can't now make a vow that contradicts that. It won't take effect and would be considered pointless. And to take God's name in that context would be taking it in a pointless context. And lastly, to swear to do something that's physically impossible also is a pointless vow. And besides that, we won't fulfill it. That's not the point here. The point is that taking the vow itself in a pointless manner and using God's name would violate this prohibition. So that's just to define what we're talking about. What we really need to do still is understand what's the big deal, right? Why is it? I mean, it sounds, like you're taking God's name in vain. It's not a nice thing, but let's try to get to the core of it. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the order of the commandments, because as we've done many times, we've discussed there's patterns, there's an order to how the commandments go. So the great commentator that we've quoted many times, the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, explains that the reason why this commandment follows number 2, which is the commandment of not serving idols, is as follows. He says, excuse me, actually, let me just quote this before I do that. This is the Talmud in one place in Shavuos, which actually means vows. There's a tractate in the Talmud about vows. And there we see sort of the how serious a vow can be. And the Talmud says that before a person takes an oath in court, the judges say to him, be aware, right? There are certain contexts actually that Jewish law requires an oath in court. So certain things if a person denies in certain instances or claims. So there's certain very specific scenarios which require an oath. And the Talmud says, but we give him the following warning before he takes the oath. We say, be aware that the entire world trembled when the Holy One, blessed be he, said at Mount Sinai, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, etc. So the Talmud teaches us that judges would actually warn a person in a very severe way with a very interesting and strong language that the whole world trembled when God spoke the third commandment, not to take God's name in vain. It doesn't say the world trembled about the first commandment. It doesn't say about the second one. It doesn't say about any of the other ones. The Talmud says it about this one. The whole world trembled at this commandment. So we see that this is something very serious. And that's what we have to try to uncover. So what is so serious about swearing a pointless vow using God's name? So the Ramban says as follows. Why does this prohibition occur after the prohibition, the commandment, the second commandment regarding idolatry? Do not have any other gods. This commandment occurs after the prohibition against idolatry. For just as it is proper to fear God and not give any honor to other deities, so too it is proper to honor his name, and one who takes his name in vain desecrates it. In other words, we go in order. Number 1, belief in God. That's the first commandment. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. Belief in God. Number 2, do not have any other gods. Do not worship any other gods. Not worship any other deities. Don't give them honor. To give them honor would be stripping God of the honor that he deserves. God is the only power in the universe. To serve other powers is to dishonor the one power. Now, there's another way, basically, is what the Ramban is saying, that one dishonors God, and that is to take his name in vain, to desecrate it, to use it loosely, basically, to use it in the context of a pointless vow. We'll see that perhaps, although again, we don't recommend it, but perhaps in the context of a true vow and a honorable vow, then it may be actually almost proper to do. The Torah actually in some places indicates that you should swear by God's name. Actually, there's an explicit verse that says, swear by his name, if it's proper. But a pointless vow is a dishonor to his name. And again, back to the Sefer HaChinuch, so he elaborates on it. So after he just defined, right, going back to the previous slide or two previous, so here the Sefer HaChinuch defined the sort of the parameters or very basic parameters of the prohibition. And then he goes into the reasoning behind it. And when he talks about the reasoning behind it, he says as follows. It is from the roots of this commandment that it is for people to know and fix in their souls and strengthen the faith in their hearts about God, blessed be he who is in the heavens above and exists forever, that there is nothing else like his existence. That's the end of the sentence. We want to fix in our hearts the greatness of God. There is nothing comparable to him, nothing like him. And it is fitting and obligatory upon us when we mention his great name upon our actions and upon our words, to mention it with fear, with awe, with trembling and perspiration, and not like those that joke and speak about something light, such as the things that exist and perish, meaning temporary things, worldly things, and then do not continue to exist, like us people, other things in the lowly world. So when we mention God, we have to do so with the utmost respect. we don't just cast it, God's name casually around like we might about things that are earthly and exist on this world. But no, when we speak about God, we have to recognize his greatness and awesomeness and approach that the use of his name with awe and care. Hence, he says, it is fitting in order to fix this matter in our hearts, to establish it in our hearts, so that his awe should be in front of us. Sorry, that just slid. To give us life and merit, it obligated us in this commandment that we not mention his holy name pointlessly. Okay, and punished with lashes the one who is lenient and transgresses it. So he mentions the courts could enact a punishment for it. We don't do this nowadays, but the courts could have in days of old. In any event, he mentions that the purpose is really to fix in our hearts an awe and a respect for God. And if we are not careful and we casually throw out his name in the wrong contexts or loosely for a pointless vow, so that's just disrespecting it. And the result will be that we will slowly desensitize ourselves to this greatness and this awe, or at least certainly fail to build it up. We want to inculcate within ourselves. That's really what he's saying. We want to inculcate within ourselves the proper awe and respect for God. And this can change our life. One of the first laws in the Shulchan Aruch, the book Code of Jewish Law, is to try to always see God before you, meaning to recognize that God sees us at all times, observes all of our actions. And it's a very high level. It's not easy to always remember that. But if we do, then our entire existence would be different. The way that we act, the way we comport ourselves will be totally different. And especially if we have that recognition at the same time as we recognize the awe and greatness of God, and how just separate this is. Actually, we touched on this last time when we talked about the plagues and this prohibition of vows, to see the distance between ourselves and God. That could be life-changing and can change our behavior completely. So this is the idea here. Says the Sefer HaChinuch, we want to inculcate within ourselves this message, the awesomeness of God, and casually throwing his name around is not going to help with that, and it will actually diminish our ability to accomplish that. It goes really even deeper than this. The Ralbag, another great medieval commentator, also discusses, like the Ramban, sort of the flow of the commandments here. And he explains that this prohibition follows the prohibition against idolatry because it involves a lack of faith in God. It's very clear when it comes to a false oath, he says, because an oath with God's name demonstrates a comparison between two things in terms of their truth and existence. Meaning to say, this is true that just as this is true, or this exists just as this exists. In other words, what does it mean? It really is getting us into sort of the technical understanding of a vow in God's name. What is a vow in God's name? Why would somebody swear by God's name? Like what is it? Like, why would you mention God's name? And what does it have to do with a vow? What does it have to do with swearing? So he explains that, and many other commentators also bring this out, that the idea behind mentioning God's name in the context of a vow is you're saying that just as this is true, just as God is true, so too my vow is true. Just as God exists, so too what I am swearing about exists and is real. Therefore, when someone swears, says the Ralbag, when someone swears something true with his name, it indicates true belief in him, right? And that's, as I mentioned before, he mentions over here, I didn't include it, but that's why in certain instances, when a person is making a vow that is true, it's appropriate to mention God's name, because if it's true and not pointless, he's going to get into why that's a problem, but a tree is a tree, that's pointless. It's true, but it's pointless. So that's a different story. But if somebody is required to swear in court and they're swearing something that's true in a Jewish court, and they're swearing that I paid him back, right? And it's true, and they swear by God's name, so that's fine. That's good, because what they're essentially saying is, just as God is true, just as God exists, so too what I say, what I claim is also true. So that's fine and dandy. But it is the opposite when someone swears falsely by his name. That indicates that the swearer does not truly believe in him, right? It's not just a lie. It's a lie and comparing it to God. So if I swear that, that I returned money that I didn't actually return, and I swear by God, so then what I'm saying, I'm claiming, just as God is true, so too my claim that I returned the money is true, right? I returned what I borrowed. I'm swearing that it's true. Just as God is true, I also swear that what I returned is true. Well, since it's not true, if it's not true, right? So then I'm saying, in a certain sense, I'm saying that God is not true either, right? So just as God is true, so too it's true that I returned the money. Well, if I didn't return the money, just as it's not true that I returned the money, it's not true that God is true. So that's a big problem, right? That's a major dishonor to God. Not just that I'm casually throwing his name out, but I'm using it for a false vow. That indicates that the swearer does not truly believe in him. And for this reason, the sin of a false oath is close to the level of the sin of idolatry, right? Now it fits very well into the context. We have, and this is where the vow is false. He's about to talk about where it's completely pointless, but at least where it's false, so far we understand the flow. The Torah says, commandment, God says, believe, I am the Lord your God, believe in God. Commandment number 1. Number 2, do not have any other deities, do not worship idols, not have any other gods. And number 3, don't take my name. So he's really discussing, don't take my name for a false vow. And also, as we'll talk about in a moment, don't take my name for a pointless vow. But don't take my name for a false vow, he's saying, is because you're basically denying the truth of God. So it fits right in with believing in God and idolatry, and then a false vow, which is also an expression of lack of belief in God. So that's how it fits into the flow, and that's why it's so severe. It's very serious. As for one who swears by God's name for no purpose, he goes on. So now he's talking about the pointless vow. This person swears that a tree is a tree. It's a pointless vow. So that shows that, I should say he, I guess, believes that there is no purpose or need for God. For that, he mentions God in the context of something for which there is need. This is my own typing, so let me just see what it's actually supposed to say. No, I think for no need for it to be true, it should say. For there is no need for it to be true. By mentioning God in the context of something for which there is no need for it to be true, because it doesn't really matter. So this type of belief is even worse than the belief of someone who believes that God has partners in running the world. I don't think I translate this so well, but basically what he's saying is that if a person takes a vow that's pointless, so they're saying just as God is true, so too trees are trees, right? So that's totally pointless, and it doesn't really have any meaning to it to say that trees are trees. Everybody knows it really carries no meaning to it. And so in a certain sense, he's saying the fact that God is true also doesn't really matter, doesn't really have any meaning to it, doesn't have any significance to it, whether God exists, God doesn't exist. To express a vow in a pointless context is, in a certain sense, saying that an expression of that, whether God exists or not is of no consequence either. Because look, I'm just casting it about in a context that's of no consequence. So that, he says, is very severe. He actually says that this is even worse than the belief of someone who believes that God has partners in running the world, which is one of the main issues of commandment number 2. Do not have any other gods. What we mean by that is, don't believe that God has partners running the world, right? God has all the power. He hasn't delegated to and left it up to other powers. That's number 2. But let's say somebody would believe that. So he's saying this is even worse than that, though, because this is saying that God has nothing to do with the world. This is saying God, it's of no consequence if there is a God, if there's not a God. Yeah, at least the number 2, the guy believes that God partners with other powers. This is saying that it's of no consequence if whether God exists or not. So Ralbag suggests that this could be taking God's name in vain for a pointless vow can actually be more severe than believing in other deities. Which is a very strong statement, but the text kind of bears that out. So that's what we started with. The text, uses a very extreme language for this prohibition, right? You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold guiltless one who takes his name. It has that additional thing, you can never be guiltless of it. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's something, serious. And like the Talmud says, the whole world shook when God made this statement. So this is probably what's prompting Ralbag to try to explain what could be worse about it. Why is this all of a sudden so bad? And he's saying that because when we mention God in the context of a vow, we're really comparing God to what we're claiming in the vow. And so if the vow is something that's not true, then we're in a sense saying that God is not true. And if the vow is something that's pointless, in a certain sense, we're saying that God is pointless. God is no consequence. So that's why this can be very severe, according to Ralbag. The Maharal also takes a similar approach to Ralbag, and he explains that again that in a certain sense, this can be worse than denying the existence of God. So I guess looking at the second type, the pointless vow, it can actually also, he says, just like Ralbag is saying, it can be worse than denying. Actually, he's really saying something more. It can be worse than denying God's existence completely. To take a pointless vow can be worse than denying God's existence. Why? So denying God's existence doesn't distort the nature of God's reality. It doesn't distort what God is. It's a strong statement that he's making, right? I think that, it's quite a distortion to say he doesn't exist, but he's kind of getting technical and saying, but you haven't redefined God. In a sense, to deny God is not as bad as redefining God, which actually, it speaks to a very important point, which we talked about back for when we talked about the first commandment, which is it's really important to have a proper understanding of what, again, we can never fully understand God, but we could know what God is not, right, in the Jewish definition. And that's what we explored when we talked about the first commandment, was how do we look, how does Jewish tradition try to define our belief in God? What is it that Judaism believes? Because lots of people believe in God, but everybody has a different definition of that. And right? And people will talk to me about a God who, who can make mistakes or things like that. And that's not the Jewish belief in God. And, our belief is that God is perfect. If somebody believes in God, but believes that God can make a mistake, then they're distorting the reality of what God is. They're missing the mark in terms of what our belief is. So it's actually really important to have a proper, and again, we can't really say what God is, but we could say what God is not. God is not someone who makes mistakes, right? So God does not have a body, right? We could say. So there's certain fundamentals that are very important. So Maharal says that this prohibition deals with the issue of distorting God's reality. So he gives an analogy. The analogy is that there's a king of a country and two cities rebel against the king. So they basically say, you're not our king anymore. One city that rebelled, they crown another man as king. They appoint a king instead of the king of the country. The other city doesn't take that step. The other city they rebel, they never appoint a new king. Instead, they just take their time to just totally rip apart and dishonor the existing king. They say he's illegitimate. They say he's an imposter. They say all sorts of things about him. They don't replace him. They just dishonor his and sort of change his image. So the first city that didn't do this, they just transferred, they just appointed a new king, a replacement. They transferred their allegiance to a different ruler. So they never really impinged on the honor of the king himself. They rejected him. We don't want you as our king, but they didn't say you're not the king, right? They didn't say that you're not a king. You don't deserve to be king. You don't. They just said we don't want you as our king, and they chose someone else. But the second city that never replaced the king, they didn't say we're replacing him. They just assaulted his honor, and they attacked the veracity of his claim to the throne. Right? They attacked him directly. So that, in a sense, could be worse than the first city that replaced him. They are going after him himself, after the king himself, and so that's one way of explaining. That's an analogy to understand why this can actually, in a sense, be more severe than replacing God with another deity and saying, okay, God handed off his power to an idol, to a deity, right? That's forbidden to believe, but it doesn't insult the honor of God. In fact, the original idolaters, Maimonides talks about, actually believed that was actually more honorable to God. They said, God is so great that we can't honor him directly. We're gonna, we'll honor his servants instead. Or they said, honoring his servants is honoring him. But they never, they didn't necessarily, an idolater doesn't necessarily deny God. He just worships other deities or replaces him with another deity. But to distort the definition of God and to casually, again, coming back to these ideas of Ralbag, I guess, to casually throw his name about and dishonor him, or to casually throw it about and say it's of no consequence, he's of no consequence. So that can actually be viewed as worse. And that, the Maharal says, that's why the world shook shuddered when God spoke this prohibition, because of the seriousness of this prohibition, which the violation of it can undermine the honor of God himself. So that's another, that's sort of trying to get a little deeper into what's so severe about this? Again, summarize what we said so far. Going back a step here. So the Ramban explained the order of the commandments, that this really deals with the honor of God. He didn't go into so much detail. He just said that this also deals with the honor of God. Sefer HaChinuch elaborated and taught that it's a matter of establishing in our hearts and recognizing, God's greatness. To casually throw about his name in the context of a pointless vow, or just freely outside of the context of a vow, is a failure to build up that awe and recognition within ourselves. And the Ralbag goes a little bit deeper into what the mechanics of a vow, the way it works, and that is that you're really comparing God to your vow. So you're saying this is true just as God is true, or this matters just as God matters. So if it's not true, then you're saying God is not true. If it doesn't matter, if it's pointless, if it's not of any consequence, you're saying that God is not of any consequence. That's why this is so severe, and you're actually could be distorting the definition of God, not just replacing him, but distorting the very definition. Now, the great medieval commentator, the Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra, has sort of a cute. He's very serious about it, but it's kind of the way he says it is sort of an attack on some who are not careful about this. He writes that many think that that this violation of this is not such a big deal. And you know what? The truth is that nowadays many think that also, right? People say, I swear to God, and they just throw it out there. And it's to be, we have to be careful about that. So he says, many think, he's writing this in, I think, the 11th century, or the 13th century, I think, actually, probably. So he says, many think that it's not a big deal, it's not a big sin to swear by God's name in vain. And he says that I'm going to show you that it's actually, in a certain way, more severe than even the other of the 10 commandments. In a certain sense, it's more severe than murder. In a certain sense, it's more severe than adultery. Now, why is that? He says, now those are obviously very, very serious, right? We all know that. So, but the difference, he says, is that you can do all the time. Murder, a person isn't murdering all the time. They're not committing adultery all the time, even if there's someone that commits those sins. But it's here and there. It's not constant. It's not as frequent. So of course it's terrible, but it's not as frequent. So in a certain sense, this sin can be worse, because a person who accustoms themselves to taking God's name in vain and swearing by God's name for no reason. So in one day you could fire off, many times the same, and violate this many times in a single day. And he says a person can be so accustomed to it that they don't even realize that they're doing it. And if you would tell them that they're doing it, then they will swear to you that they're not doing it. So that's his line. He says, right, even if you try to rebuke them and tell them, you stop swearing by God's name, they'll say, I swear to God that I didn't do it, right? So they'll swear that they didn't do it. So that's how accustomed a person could become to doing this. And everything they say, well, I promise, I swear, right? And again, we always have to be careful about any vow, promising or taking a vow, but we're specifically talking about with God's name. That's where it takes it to a whole new level. And the Ibn Ezra uses a very strong language. He says that he thinks that this is one of the main causes for the long exile that we find ourselves in, because people aren't careful. Or he says that it's not exactly how he says it. He says that this one sin is enough to lengthen the exile on its own. So he's very concerned about this, and we see that it's quite serious. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, the sages teach us a very interesting idea with regards to vows that are taken in vain. And it says, wild beasts come to the world for swearing in vain. That the sin of swearing by God's name in vain brings wild beasts upon man. So it's an interesting idea. What's behind it? What's the connection? Why would it be that taking God's name in vain brings wild beasts upon man? So one of the great commentators on the Mishnah on Pirkei Avos, Rabbeinu Yonah, so he explains as follows. He says, the reason is because the difference between us and the beasts is in oral expression, in our ability to speak. That's what differentiates us. It's our intellect, but the way that it manifests itself is in speech. This is why we rule over them. And therefore, one who does not concern himself in this way for the glory of his creator is fitting that he should be trampled by the beasts. If we don't just separate ourselves, or if we're not careful with the mechanism, the vehicle that we have that differentiates us from the beasts, so then they no longer differentiate between us and them, and they come upon us. It's interesting, when we learned about last week about the plagues, we did not connect the plague of wild animals with this commandment, but we see that there's actually a very explicit connection. So that's sort of the intro here. The Rabbeinu Yonah says that the difference between us and beasts is our oral expression. This is why we rule over them. Therefore, one who does not concern himself in this way is fitting that he should be trampled by the beast. We have to kind of build on this and try to understand it a little bit more. So we could look back, for starters, at the creation of man. The very creation of man, we find, the verse says, God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the livestock, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So at the very creation of mankind, there's already this connection between man's dominion over animals and being created in God's image, right? So it says, let us make man in our image, b'tselem Elokim, right, in God's image, after our likeness. Let them, and then as a result, there seems to be a connection here. If we are created in God's image, so then we will rule over the fish and the birds and the animals, etc. So we see a clear connection between being created in God's image and ruling over animals. After the flood, when Noah comes out of the ark, so God tells him, it says, God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and your fear and your dread shall be upon all the beasts of the earth and upon all the fowl of the heaven, upon everything that creeps, etc. So there's this idea that the animals they stay away from us. They stay away from people. And that's, generally the reality. The animals stay out of the cities. They stay away from people. I know in my neighborhood, the deer have invaded, but when they see people, they run the other way. Well, I guess we invaded their territory. That's really why they're around. But in general, animals stay away from people. But the Mishnah, the sages in Pirkei Avos are telling us that if we swear by God's name in vain, then wild beasts come. That protection, that which they stay away from us falls away, and then they come after us. And it seems to relate. The Rabbeinu Yonah speaks about the power of speech. The verse over here in Genesis, in the creation, seems to relate us being in the image of God to our dominion over animals. So the truth is, though, that those two ideas are very interrelated. The idea of the power of speech and being in the image of God. There's many different aspects to being created in the image of God. But one thing that the commentaries say is that the image of God is something, it takes upkeep, right? Not just the physical image, but sort of the spiritual image. It takes upkeep. We have to maintain, we have to keep our side, right? We have to maintain ourselves spiritually in order to maintain that image. And if we are not, if we're not performing spiritual maintenance, upkeep and maintaining our spiritual status, then we begin to lose that stature of being in the image of God. And so it could come to a point, if a person is sinning in general, really, not only with this, not only by taking vows in vain, taking God's name in vain, but we desecrate ourselves, our likeness to God. We're no longer in the likeness of God, and then the animals don't necessarily stay away from us. The Talmud makes the following statement in Shabbos. It says, Rami Bar Abba said, an animal does not overpower a person until he appears to it as an animal. As it is stated, but man does not abide in honor. He is like the beasts that perish. Okay, interpreting the verse takes more looking into how that verse bears out the idea. But the idea of the Talmud is that an animal, as long as the animal recognizes the human as a human, as someone in the image of God, so then they stay away. But if they appear as an animal, just another animal, so then the animal overpowers the person. And what the Talmud is telling us is that mankind is elevated. We're not the same. We're not just another animal. I'm reminded, someone once told me a story of a certain rabbi was on an airplane, and he was not a vegetarian. We've given a class about vegetarianism before. There is, it could be that there's good things about being a vegetarian. There's also reasons to eat meat. There's both. But anyways, this rabbi was not a vegetarian, and he was sitting next to someone who took issue with the fact that he was eating meat. So the person next to him on the plane said, how could you eat another animal? Implying you're an animal and it's an animal. How can you eat another animal? So his response was, other animals eat other animals. So once you're saying that I'm an animal, well, then other animals also eat other animals. But the point that I want to make is we're not just animals. We are an elevated creation. We're the pinnacle of creation. We are the purpose of creation. We're something greater. We are B'Tselem Elokim. We're created in the image of God. And we have purpose, we have intellect, and we have the power of speech. And these things all separate us from animals. We are able to reach spiritual heights. We are able to attain spirituality, to attain a connection to God. That's something that animals cannot do. And but the Talmud really is telling us here, but if we desecrate that image of God, if we desecrate our souls, if we don't work on again spiritual maintenance of our soul, so then we are just another animal. And once we're just another animal, then the animals are no longer afraid of us. It's when we keep up our state as image of God, that's when they will keep away from us. There's a story told, I wasn't there, so I can't verify it, but there's a story told of Rabbi Nassan Adler. He was the Rebbe of Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer. So this would be somewhere in the 19th century. And they were traveling by wagon, and early 19th century, I guess. And they were traveling by wagon, and they were going through a forest, and a bear came upon their wagon, a wild bear, and they heard screaming from the driver. And Rabbi Adler, again, the Rebbe, the teacher of the Chassam Sofer, poked his head out of the window to see what was going on. The bear saw the rabbi, and he turned around and fled. And the rest of the people in the wagon were astonished by this. And his response, he said simply, "Perhaps the image of God has not left me." So he felt that it was the fact, it was this very point, it was this very very line in the Talmud that if the animal recognizes the image of God in the person, then the animal will turn away. But we have to sort of bring this back to speech and to taking God's name in vain. And what it has to come back to is that there's, I guess, different ways to affect our Tselem Elokim, our image of God. And it seems, at least, that speech and really speaking about God in a way that diminishes God, using it casually, etc. So we reflect that. If we use God's name casually, if we desecrate God's name, so then if we're the image of God, well, we've just desecrated that image. We've desecrated ourselves. We've lowered ourselves. And then we no longer have that same status as being in the image of God. So to understand really what the sages meant, it seems that the depth of it, and really, I guess, what Rabbi Yonah meant, when he said, when the sages say that wild beasts come to the world for swearing in vain, and Rabbi Yonah says that the difference between us is our oral expression. So there's there's 2 points, I guess. One is that this is what distinguishes us from them, and if we're misusing it, so then God says, you're misusing that which distinguishes you from them. I'm going to take away that distinction, and the animals will begin to come after mankind. But the second point that other commentators bring out is this other point that we're using our speech, if by swearing in vain we are denigrating God and the definition or the understanding, our belief in God, so then our image of God would reflect that. So we no longer have as that image of God anymore. So then that distinction between us and animals falls away, and they can come after us. So that's, I guess, another approach to what it is about this this prohibition that makes it so severe, is also in the way that it affects us, right? There's the way that we're speaking about God, right? Like we said with the Ralbag, about redefining God's reality, saying that God is of no consequence, saying that God doesn't exist. That all could be expressed in a vow that's taken with God's name in vain. But also, we also are affecting ourselves. We're affecting our own image of God by doing that. And so it brings us down also at the same time. So we can understand that this is a serious concern, and something that we should be aware of as the third commandment of the 10 commandments. Just in the last couple minutes, I'm going to go across the board. I didn't put it on the screen, to commandment number, I guess we're up to commandment number 7, which is do not steal. And I'm not going to give a class on that because I don't have a class on it. But I'll just very briefly mention, so that the commandment not to steal is understood in our tradition to actually refer to not to steal a person. Do not kidnap. Elsewhere in the Torah, a number of times it says not to steal property, not to steal somebody's things. But the commandment in the 10 commandments is traditionally understood to actually refer to not to steal a person, not to kidnap. If you learn Sefer HaChinuch, right, the book of mitzvah education that we mentioned earlier, where he gives a reason for the different mitzvos. So some of them he says, I don't need to tell you the reason, it's obvious. So this is one of them. For don't kidnap, he says, obvious, it's a terrible thing to kidnap. We don't have to explain it. What I just want to very briefly do is connect it to this commandment that we're talking about today. Do not swear in vain, because that's what we do. We go across, and I'm trying to understand the connection between right? So we had, I am the Lord your God connects to do not murder. We had do not serve other idols, connects to do not commit adultery. And now we have do not take God's name in vain. How does that connect to do not steal? So the Midrash says the connection is because if a person steals, and this Midrash, I guess, is looking at it not so much as kidnapping, but as stealing, so then a person will come to swear by God's name in vain, or falsely at least. So because they are going to deny what they did. So that's what the Midrash says. You'll come to take vows with God's name in vain as a result. Another understanding, another connection that I've heard from Rabbi David Foreman in a class that I once listened to, where he goes through the different connections, and he wanted to suggest, I don't know if this was his own idea or someone else, but that they both have to do with misappropriating something. The taking God's name in vain, using God's name in the wrong context is misappropriating it. It doesn't belong here. It doesn't belong in the context of a pointless vow or in a false vow. It belongs in the context of a true vow. It belongs in the context of a blessing. There are certain places where God's name does belong, but to use it in the context of something casual or pointless or meaningless, so that's misappropriating it and putting it in the wrong place. And that's the connection to do not kidnap. Do not kidnap is also that idea, that at its core, it's misappropriating, or do not steal, really, it's misappropriating property, it's misappropriating a person, putting property in a place that it doesn't belong. If somebody steals somebody else's stuff, it doesn't belong there. It doesn't belong in my possession, it belongs in your possession. Certainly to take a person and place them in where they don't belong is a misappropriation of that person. So that's what he sees as the connection between these two commandments. Something to think about. We're open to hearing more ideas about that. We will conclude with that. All right.